glad to have a chance to be here today. So let's get right into it. So regardless of our disciplines, I teach in the School of Education. My background is in developmental and cognitive psychology. But I think all of us who work in higher education are faced with this gap when especially if we work in the professions, healthcare, education, law, those kinds of areas. There's a gap on the one hand, on the one side. There's the world of work where we are preparing students to enter a professional field. On the other side, in creating the gap, is the university classroom and the kinds of knowledge and skills that are privileged in each one of these worlds, the university classroom versus the world of higher education, the world of work, creates this kind of gap that students can get caught in. And so I've been interested in pedagogies that try to foster the development of expertise and facilitate this movement between the university classroom that privileges knowledge and theories and the world of work that has a more practical, interpersonal, social context. So I'd just like everyone to take a minute now. I don't know what your disciplines are. If we were in the same room together, I'd have a chance to ask you these things. But if you could think in your discipline, what's an essential skill that your students will need that's difficult to teach through telling? And so, for example, in my area, I work in teacher education. One of the things that we woefully neglect, I believe, is the development of teachers' social competence. Teaching, as you all know, is a very social activity. It requires interpersonal skills, relationship building, and yet we devote precious little time in the curriculum to helping students master those kinds of things that are often called soft skills. So just take a minute right now to think about, in your field, what's a soft skill or a social competence or a skill that's difficult to teach through telling? Okay. And I'd like you to hold on to that idea, because here's the agenda that I'm going to try to breeze through in the next 20 minutes, which is I believe that case studies, represent a solution to this dilemma, this gap between the world of work and the university classroom. And I think that they are, and I'll explain why I believe cases are important pedagogy. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've taken the classic case method that we use in a face-to-face classroom discussion, and I've been creating digital resources that bring the case to more vivid life, and it's often difficult, especially if our goal is to teach social competence. When we're reading a flat two-dimensional text-based case, we miss a lot of social information that we can only learn by observation or through seeing or hearing, appreciating the social context. So I'm going to talk there about an inquiry cycle architecture that transforms the more linear case model into a form of pedagogy. And then as I'm doing that, I'm also going to talk about how I've been able to publish in this area using my classroom essentially as a laboratory for testing case materials and seeing how they propel learning or not. And I'll provide some evidence from that. Okay, so why cases? There's nothing really new here. Dewey was talking about this in 1938, this problem of inert knowledge. Inert knowledge being the things that we know that we can't grab and pull up and use in an immediate context. We know facts, but we don't know how to transform them into action. And research and expertise, particularly Erickson's work, has shown that repeated immersion in authentic tasks builds expertise, or that connection between knowledge and action. That's conditional knowledge in the world of cognitive psychology. And the idea there, again, being that when we have our knowledge immersed in a social context, it makes acquiring new knowledge easier. So theoretically, we're in the wheelhouse of Vygotsky, cognitive apprenticeship. Some of you may know this as anchored instruction or problem-based learning. But essentially, the case provides a social context. It's a narrative. It is an authentic problem. And here is what is, I think, the active ingredients of the case, is that it requires that the learner is manipulating, representing, and interpreting information. And if Piaget was here, he would tell us that this is the heat that fosters disequilibrium. And it's in that space where the student is confused or uncertain about action that there's an opportunity for us to teach. So if these theories hold to be true, then what we would see is that cases work. And so an example from a field that's been using cases for decades now is medicine, medical education. Harvard Medical School, for example, has shown that, and it makes sense when you think of the theory, there's no difference in the kinds of content knowledge or test-taking ability students who have received case-based instruction versus not case-based instruction. No difference in their medical board exams, a standardized test of content knowledge. But where you do see a difference in those who are exposed to case-based instruction are in these areas of, again, social competence, soft skills, the things that are the non-cognitive aspects of expert performance. And so the takeaway here is that cases won't necessarily improve your intellectual or cognitive understanding of something, but it can improve your ability to recognize a situation in which you can use that knowledge. So why do we get these effects? Why do we get these outcomes? Well, I think one of the best ways to talk about this is by comparing the elements of case-based instruction to more traditional didactic, say, lecture-based instruction. I'm not knocking on lecture. A really good lecture is a powerful tool for learning. What I'm doing here is comparing the aspects of each of these pedagogies. So in a case, the problem is at the center stage as opposed to more of a backdrop where it privileges information. In a case, the instructor is more of a facilitator who is trying to bridge students and their prior knowledge to the world of work or the context in which the problem space resides. They're really a catalyst in the classic sense of Piagetian constructivism. They're a catalyst for discovery on the learner's part. They make construction happen. So in this way, then, the student immediately rises to a more active participant in the learning process. There's greater engagement. The tools that are used, the student, again, being very active, is participating, speaking, reading, writing, listening, reflecting. And again, this allows opportunities for more frequent interaction. If I'm, for example, launching my opinion about a case or my understanding of it, a classmate has a different understanding, now we've got something to work with. The advantages for case-based instruction, as opposed to traditional instruction, again, a lecture-based, is that this is a very efficient coverage message, right? Lecturing can cover a lot of content, and there's a place in every learning opportunity for hearing what the expert knows. But if we want students to take away a more durable understanding, then they're going to have to construct that themselves. And again, the problem we're trying to resolve is this inert knowledge. So cases are important to us because they develop flexible knowledge. So what happens in a traditional case method or case instruction? Those of you who use cases, I apologize for repeating this, but this is essentially the linear model. It goes from one phase to the next and so on through 4 phases. The first part of the case is preparation. Students must read the case, come to class prepared to discuss it, and in class the instructor starts to ask important, powerful questions that elicit students' understanding of just the facts. What's the case about? Then you move to, okay, what are your opinions about the case? What are your understandings of the case? What did you construct to be important? Interpretation is essential here. Then this is, again, the idea that this would surface differences of opinion that lead us then to the third phase, where now we have a learning opportunity in front of us. The students recognize there might be a gap between my opinion and your opinion, your interpretation and my interpretation. There might also be a gap between what I know and understand about the case and yet what I know that now I know that I don't know, right? So I've reached a gap in my knowledge. My knowledge is not sufficient to solve the problem. So now I'm asking questions. And the final step, all right, where can I go to get my questions answered? And this is supposed to operate as an inductive model for the kinds of reasoning we would ask students to do in the future on their own. So there's some expectation that this could become a habit of mind in our students to identify the facts, interpret them, recognize what they need to know next, and identify where they're going to go to get that information. So now, having talked about why cases or what's the theoretical and empirical foundation behind a case-based approach, I'd like to move into the final 2 areas, and that is how I'm trying to translate this linear model of the case method facts, opinions, questions, and resources, that linear model. I'm trying to create a more dynamic, closing the loop is how I'm thinking about it, and I'm drawing from the work of Dan Schwartz, who is now the dean of Stanford School of Education. At the time, Dan was a faculty member at Vanderbilt and was working to create this, you might recognize it as called a legacy cycle. It's an inquiry cycle model. So that's the architecture I'm drawing from. And I'd like to spend the next couple of minutes talking about this as a pedagogical design, because I think it's a rich way of expanding the case method, not a substitute for it, but a way of expanding on it, even in face-to-face settings. With the rise of new technologies that make problem spaces very vivid, we have an opportunity to go beyond using the classic text-based approach to case-based instruction. So here is an example. I simply offer this as an example of how I've adapted this inquiry cycle to my discipline. And as I step through it, the thing to keep in mind are what are these 4 phases, and it would, if you could think about, okay, what would be a relevant parallel in my field. So the first step in this kind of instruction is to identify a case challenge. What's a learning objective? Again, that very first question I asked you. What's a skill that your students will need to be able to perform that's difficult to teach through telling? That should be the learning objective, the target of the case. So in my example, the target of the case is communication skills, teachers' ability to communicate with parents about their child's progress in school. So I draw from cases that get at this professional skill. Then we move into the next phase, which is generate ideas. I ask the learner to assume the role of the teacher in the case. They are the problem solver. They've read the situation from the teacher's point of view, identified facts, made some interpretations. Now I ask them to lay out a plan of action. If you were responsible for solving this problem, what would you do? Essentially what I'm trying to get at here is their prior knowledge. This is my assessment of what they're bringing to the case, what they're transferring in, or what they already know, and the typical problem-solving approach they would take. Then we move to the next phase, which is exploring resources. Here the goal is to open up their perspective on the problem. I've elicited their ideas, they've generated their prior knowledge. Now they're moving into looking at the problem space from multiple perspectives. An analysis of the problem space. Here I ask them, the digital resources that I've created are video models. So I've created industrial or demonstration videos of how different kinds of teachers would solve the problem. In your discipline, you might use video, you might use someone talking through how they solve a problem. The choices of your resources are vast. They could include video, interviews with experts, audio files, artifacts that you want students to analyze, websites or readings you want them to extract information from and compare. But comparison here is really an important element, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But what we're doing here in this Explore Resources phase is trying to emulate what happens in the face-to-face setting where students are comparing their opinions. We're asking the learner to compare their ideas to other people's perspectives. The final phase of the cycle is a reflect and revise. Here we ask students to look back to their original answers, their response to the generate ideas phase. What is your prior knowledge? Now you've been exposed to some other ways of looking at the problem. Look back at your original answer, and in light of all the resources you've explored and the multiple points of view you've seen, what would you change, if anything, about your original response? And I use that difference between their prior knowledge and their revision at the end of the case as a measure of their learning, of what the case has to offer in terms, I guess I would say, a dosage. What's the impact of the case on their understanding? So again, this is an example, a framework of how we can create digital resources or add more resources to our traditional case method. So if we're thinking about adopting this model, one of the first things we need to think about is what is a good case. And so essentially what we're talking about here is content validity. We want to choose a case that has a clear statement of purpose, right? We know exactly what skill or target we're after. it's something that is prevalent. It's a common problem that all novices would need to be exposed to. So it should be valuable and relevant to their professional development. It should be complex enough for them to get confused a little bit or to not be sure of what the right answer is and need to think deeply about it. It should also be a realistic or authentic problem space. And then once you've identified this kind of case, you might select cases from libraries that exist in your field. In the sciences and law, there's a rich case library. Then after you've identified your case, we want to think of a prompt. What kind of prompt will elicit prior knowledge? For me, again, and I offer this only as an example of generate ideas. The prompt here is projecting the learner into the problem space and saying, you are responsible for solving this problem. What are you going to do? That's the active ingredient of this phase. So once we've generated ideas, once we've elicited students' prior knowledge, what do we do with that information? And for me, I reference here publication Walker and Dodger 2012 as an example of my scholarship in this area. So one of the first steps I've done in this work is to ask experts to validate my cases. So once I've created a case, I would show it to other experts in my field and get them to rate it for its realism, complexity, prevalence, and what they think the learning objective is. I can get a panel of people to weigh in on its content validity. That's a form of scholarship because I'm trying to articulate the domain knowledge of a field. So expert performance benchmarks are a logical first step, and the way I sourced this was just to send out an email blast and an IRB to the people in my field saying, could you read these 5 short cases and fill out this checklist and get back to me? It was a very efficient way of collecting data. So the point here is if you've elicited prior knowledge, you're going to have a metric to compare students' knowledge to, and I recommend expert panels who've already validated your cases as an efficient way to do that. Here I offered just a couple of screenshots that the ways that I use this in a face-to-face context or in an online setting. Again, the critical element here is when you're using digital resources is to ask students to compare them. You want to offer them contrasting points of view. So for example, there's a lot of rich material in video, tone of voice, body language, nonverbals, all these essential skills that are so important to professionalism, but a text-based case cannot convey. And that's why I think video and audio, where you're talking to experts, these kinds of things that make practice vivid, are very important for novices to be exposed to. So again, and the contrasts, let me say that I think the contrasts need to be complex. They more complex than a good example and a bad example. Complex in that the teacher 1 has good points and bad points. Teacher 2 also has good points and bad points. And that there are consequences. They each experience a different kind of consequence. Here my guiding theory is Bandura's observational learning. The idea that, again, by watching other people struggle, and seeing their outcome, was it success or failure, I know how to organize my own behavior when I'm in a similar situation in the future. So again, identifying a case, validating its contents by an expert panel, and then giving students that same case. Now you have a data set of comparing novices and experts, and the idea that part of what we're talking about is having students see how an expert might think. Which brings me to the next and final phase, which is where you ask students to compare their prior knowledge to that of the expert. So you could do that through, I give them a checklist. To what extent did your plan include this? To what extent did your plan reference this other skill? I ask them to independently compare their response to an expert's. Okay, so what have I learned from this? Here's an example again from my scholarship. I had a case adopted by 4 different universities in the United States who prepare future teachers. So I've got a sample size here of about 200. What I'm gratified to see is the blue bar is their response to the Generate Ideas prompt in a specific case. The orange is their response later on, the Reflect and Revise. So I see growth in many of the areas that I'd like to see, and in particular, their ability to initiate the conversation and their ability to wrap it up with concrete problem-solving steps. One disappointment in this is that I really wanted to see a bump in their communication skills, in particular in empathy. I didn't see that bump, and so now I'm keep thinking about what can I do to add more heat? What can I do to create a shift in their empathy? Is it possible? And if so, what would that look like? And again, this is an example of scholarship. I could also look at this. I could compare these to experts' reasoning, right? So part of my data set could be how did the experts respond to this, and then how did the novices, beginning and end of the case. Essentially, the large question here, the assumption I'm making, is that there is some kind of transfer, that what the students get, again, getting back to making it a habit of mind, part of what we're talking about or striving to do in using cases, whether they're digital or not, is to inculcate this habit of mind of thinking through a problem space. So the bet I'm making is that one case is good, two cases better, three is even better still. So another area of scholarship is comparing issues of dosage. How many cases does it take to begin to see some impact of taking on this habit of mind? One other area that I'm working in my scholarship right now is taking these online cases and using them as a scaffold for future live action simulations. So my students will have a vicarious learning experience grounded in observational learning theory. They watch these video models, and then I put them into a situation where they have to enact or engage in the problem space themselves. And in this case, I hire actors to play parents. You could also use role play and those kinds of mechanisms. So just to wrap up, I make the argument that these digital resources are really important. They could be dropped into a face-to-face or an online environment, depending on what your goals are. Of course, there are advantages to each of these learning environments. One question I get often about this is how do I assess learning? And so I would just say that there are ways you can use these individually and as a group assignments. You can use them formatively, summatively. Here are some of the examples that ways that I have used them in the past. And then I'd just like to close by saying that I see cases, again, as a form of scholarship. We invest in our teaching. We spend time preparing for our teaching, so why not take it that one next level? We're collecting the data and grading it anyway. Why not take it one more step and use our cases as a form of scholarship? Here I've aggregated a few resources on how we can frame our use of cases in our teaching as scholarship. And then I've also collected a couple of really robust online resources that have that refer to cases or that offer a case library. All right, and so that's it. There's my contact information, and I'll open it up for any questions or discussion.
Thank you, Joan. That was really great. I answered a lot of questions that I've had, and I love how you tied the scholarship in there as well. I think that's something that a lot of folks within our system are starting to think a lot more about. If you have a question, you can either raise your hand if you have a mic, and we will unmute you and let you ask your question, or you could send it in the chat bar at the bottom. Or if you can't find the hand and just want to say, hey, unmute my mic, you can do that in the chat bar as well. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah, the cases are really, in my opinion, low-hanging fruit in terms of data.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, though. These are things that we do in the classroom anyway, and as scholarly teachers, we ask these questions. And so the next step is just to officially gather data, go through the IRB process, and make this part of our scholarship. So I love that. Chung Woo is asking if we will share the slides. And Joan, did you say that we could do that?
Absolutely. Glad to share them.